Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 305 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Mercurio D. Rivera. He's the author of more than 20 science fiction stories, which have appeared in magazines such as Asimov's and Inner Zone, in anthologies such as Solaris Rising 2 and Year's Best SF-17, and on podcasts such as Escape Pod and Starship Sofa. He's also a member of the Manhattan writing group Altered Fluid, which also includes previous guests such as Matthew Kressel, Rajan Khanna, and Sam J. Miller. And I just want to note that today's guest is named Mercurio David Rivera, and he goes by David, so that's why you'll hear me refer to him that way during this interview. And we'll be speaking with him today about his short story collection Across the Event Horizon from Newcon Press. And now, here's our interview with Mercurio D. Rivera. All right, so we're here with Mercurio D. Rivera. Welcome to the show.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so first of all, tell us about the writing class that you took with Terry Bisson.
Boy, I was taking a break from work at the time, and one thing that I always wanted to try my hand at was writing science fiction. This was back in 2001, 2002 or so, and I took a course at the New School on writing science fiction, and Terry Bisson was one of the instructors, and I was very familiar with Terry's work, and he was the instructor and had a phenomenal time in the class, learned a lot from him, so much so that I wound up repeating the class just to have that same experience again, and wound up going back a third time, only this time Terry was no longer teaching the course. It was Alice Turner, the editor of Playboy, was the instructor at the time. And Alice helped me learn the basics of writing, point of view, and just the basic elements of storytelling that helped me become a writer, I think. So I'm very grateful to both Terry and to the late Alice Turner.
Yeah, I mean, I love Terry Bisson's stories. His story, They're Made Out of Meat, is one of my favorites.
Oh, yeah. It's also, I think that might have been nominated for the Hugo and hold the record as the shortest story ever nominated for Hugo. But Terry has a very unique approach to putting a story together, almost a mechanical approach. So he had his students give him a pitch and then submit the beginning of the story, the middle, and then the ending. And so I kind of appreciated that mechanical approach, and it's something that I still use to this day.
Now, when you walked into that class for the first time, had you written any science fiction at that point?
Not a word.
Wow.
Not a word. Not a word. And, I've read a lot of science fiction, but truthfully, I hadn't written fiction at all. But it's something that I always wanted to do.
So what kind of stuff had you read that made you want to write science fiction yourself?
Well, I loved David Brin's works. I loved Orson Scott Card's works. All the classics, Arthur C. Clarke and Asimov. And I always remember reading Dune for the first time. I picked it up out of a library. I must have been 14 years old, 13 or 14. And I read it, and I was like, "Oh my God, this is an amazing book! People should be reading this." I didn't realize it was such a well-known work.
That's funny. Now, so when you mentioned taking a class with Alice Turner, I was talking to Matt Kressel recently, and he mentioned he took a class with Alice Turner. Was that the same class? Is that how you met him? No,
I mean, I think it was different semesters, different years. He took it before I did, actually.
Uh-huh. So how did you meet him?
Alice suggested, I had talked to Alice about joining a writer's group. She'd mentioned that some of her former students had gone and formed a writer's group, and so I told her that I was interested, so she referred me to them. I sent an email to the group, didn't hear back for many, many months, 6 months of silence, so I tried again, and then I was welcomed to come attend a meeting, and the next thing I knew, I had joined this writer's group, which is called Altered Fluid. And that's where Matt was, and that's where Paul Berger and Chris Deichman and all people that are still members. This is back in 2004 that I joined the group. And here we are. Gosh, I can't believe it's 14 years later. And, we're all still part of the same writers group. And it's amazing seeing how those careers progress, by the way. When I joined the group, there was nobody had published anything. And nowadays, it's amazing what people have accomplished.
Did you ever find out what happened to your first email? Did they just never get it, or?
Uh, this is a really good question. I think that what happened was Paul had forwarded it I contacted Paul Berger. He was the contact person for the group, and he forwarded it to the group, and they had kind of agreed to follow up with me, and then things fell through the cracks.
Well, it's good that you got hooked up with them finally. So it says in your bio that you did a live on-air critique on Hour of the Wolf. Could you tell us about that?
Sure, that was really frightening. Jim Freund had asked us to do a live critiquing session on his radio show, Hour of the Wolf, and a few of us volunteered. We did a drawing to see which of us would be the fortunate or unfortunate one, depending on your point of view, to be critiqued, and I won. So I wrote a story, and it was called The Fifth Daniel, and we went on the show, and I read the story out loud over the air, and then we treated it as if though it was a regular session of our writers group after that. Normally in our writers group, we don't read the stories, but in this case, for the radio show, we did. And then we did our usual bit, which is we went around the room. Everybody took 3 or 4 minutes to give their critiques. And then afterwards, we had an open discussion. And all of this took place live on the radio. And then we took questions from callers, which was also bizarre. We had some really strange callers.
Strange how?
Well, somebody called up and said, I liked the story, but it didn't have trolls in it. I think that person was a troll. So, some very, weird calls like that. But it was really interesting, going through that whole experience. And then the story later on, I took the critiques, I revised the story, I turned it into The Fifth Z, and later on went to publish that story.
Yeah, and it's in the collection, so people can check it out there. So were the people, were they giving you friendlier critiques since you were on the air and it was public, or were they just as brutal as usual?
Just as brutal as usual. I think that people wanted to give a realistic look at how the group operates. The group is never really cruel. You always want to give constructive criticism. So you start off with what's working in the story, and then what's not working in the story, how you would improve it, and then you usually end on a good note. That's just the form that the critiques always take. It's almost a formula. So it's never, and you never critique just for the sake of sounding smart or just being a jerk. The objective is to make the story better. So since everybody has that point of view, you always should walk away feeling inspired. If you're not inspired, then the group is not working. So, I felt inspired after the radio show, just like I do after all of our meetings.
Well, so this episode is not going to involve any live on-air critiquing, in case you were worried about that. So,
okay.
And so, why did you change the title from The Fifth Daniel to The Fifth G?
I wanted to give it a more, an international flair. It was pointed out to me during the critiquing session that it was very United States centric, and it's dealing with a global threat of an alien stock that's literally cutting the earth in half. It's like a toothpick going through the heart of an olive. And so it's a worldwide catastrophe, and yet the story was very U.S. centric. So I thought, that's a really good point. Let me pick a different country. So instead of by the way, it's an army of clones that are sent on a final assault against this alien stock. And so I thought I'd make it a Chinese group of clones, just to make it more of a worldwide threat.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I wanted to ask you about getting back to Terry Bisson for a second. In the introduction to this book, he says about you, there are many literary pleasures in his work, nuances of character, precision of plot, prose that skitters and shines, humor and horror galore, but they are all subordinate to the central agenda of classic science fiction, the presentation of weird, wonderful, and thought-provoking ideas. And I was just wondering, do you agree with that? What do you think about that? That quote?
Well, I paid him a lot of money to write that. No, that's very generous of him. I do agree that when I write science fiction stories, the focus always is from some central weird idea. And then from there, that's what I always start a story with, that in mind, and then build around that central idea, characters. So, that's the starting point. And, So I agree with Terry's comment that weird and wonderful is the way to go.
I mean, I feel like there's a lot of sort of peer pressure or something these days, not to say I write science fiction about ideas. It feels like everyone, do you feel like peer pressure that everyone's like, oh, David, you should say that you write genre bending stuff. That's what all the cool kids are doing or something.
Yeah, that is the trend, and I do resent that. I resent it because the implication is that if you're writing straightforward science fiction, that you're not really doing anything cutting edge, you're not running anything socially significant, and the best science fiction is both those things. And it doesn't have to be genre bending, it doesn't have to transcend the boundaries of the genre, as is common to say these days. I think if you just write a traditional science fiction story, by its very nature, if it's executed properly, it can have strong literary merit, it can make social commentary, it can do all those things. So yeah, I mean, I realize that's the cool thing to say, but I don't think it's accurate.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I really like hard science fiction, sort of classical science fiction, particularly in short stories where you can just go through a whole book and just be bombarded by all these cool, thought-provoking ideas. And what happened is I read a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Vandana Singh, and she had a short story collection which was more hard science fiction. And I read it, and I was like, wow, this is great. And so I went looking for more, and that's how I sort of gave me the thought to talk to you about your book. But there's not a lot of books like this that are, new single author hard science fiction short stories. And I wish there were more because I love this stuff.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Let's put a call out there for more of them.
Because, and certainly from reading these stories, I mean, you seem to be, to have kind of an interest in science. Some of these stories, they reference concepts like Bose-Einstein condensates and dark energy. Could you talk about how do you keep up with science, or how do you keep up with science?
I do, and I don't sit down and read scientific journals or anything like that, but I do watch the Science Channel, and I do watch documentaries about space. So I am familiar with some basic concepts, and then sometimes just the story itself requires you to do some research, like in one of the stories in the collection called Missionaries that you just mentioned. I had a being that was made of light, and I wanted to find a way to contain it. And I thought, is there any way to slow down light? So all I did a Google search, and I looked into it and realized that there's something called Bose-Einstein condensates that can actually slow down light, almost freeze light in its place, which is a really bizarre concept. So I stuck that in the story. But yeah, I do watch a lot of science shows. So I'm not necessarily an expert, but I can become an expert when it's necessary.
Yeah, well, because if you're talking about classical science fiction, I mean, one of the things that I think science fiction should be doing is making you consider new things and look at familiar things in a new way. And it really frustrates me a lot that so much TV and Hollywood science fiction especially doesn't do that. It's just, they have laser guns and they have spaceships, but it doesn't really make you think about things in a different way. And I think one of the things I really like about these stories is that it does that. I mean, like an example that comes to mind for me is in your story Doubled. The premise is that sort of everybody in society is a twin, and that's considered normal. And then to not be a twin is sort of a weird minority. And the twin people think of the non-twin people as aberrant. And it's just really interesting how you do that.
Yeah, that's all the stories in my collection, that probably is the most Twilight Zone type story, I think, in the collection, in that it's about the concept of individuality, and there is sort of a little twist ending at the end in Twilight Zone fashion, but yeah, I like that conceit of redefining what's normal. If you think about the episode of Twilight Zone where everybody is deformed, and there's a woman who is being operated on to make her. Sorry, everybody in the world is deformed, but there's a woman who's really beautiful, and she's considered ugly because she's the only beautiful person in the world. I always like that idea of turning things on its head in that way. So that's what this story does. It takes the idea of being an individual and making that a crime in this society.
Yeah, Eye of the Beholder, I think, is that Twilight Zone episode?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So how'd you get the idea to write this story about twins? Are you a twin, or do you know some twins, or where'd that come from?
it's hard to say. I wanted to come up with, a society where things were different, and I just thought of twins. I can't think of where where that idea came from, but, I just like the idea of, exploring individuality in that way. I don't know any twins, strangely enough, but I've always been fascinated by twins. And,
Well, if there are any twins listening, you should reach out to David and introduce yourself. So he
absolutely. One of the things that's interesting me most about twins, David, is I know that there's research done about twins that are separated at birth, and that they go on to do they wind up in the same profession. I found that very bizarre, because you wonder about how much of our lives is predisposed by genetics and how much of it is determined by the environment. So I've always found that fascinating when you split twins up and they wind up in the same profession. Hard to explain other than genetics, but it's hard to believe genetics plays a role in your professional choices. So very strange.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, so yeah, obviously you're interested in twins, and you seem to be really interested in aliens. It seems like there are a lot of stories about aliens in this book. Would you say that you have a particular interest in aliens compared to other science fiction writers that you know?
I think so. And the funny thing is, somebody mentioned that to me at a convention recently, and they said, it's amazing how many stories of yours involve aliens. And I thought, really? I didn't think so. And it was only when he mentioned that comment that I sat down and looked at my work and realized, holy cow, he's right. There's probably 90% of the stories involve aliens of some sort or another. So yeah, I think I do have a particular interest in that. It's traditional sci-fi, but again, it's something that I'm proud of, and I think we can, you can do interesting things with them.
I mean, are there examples as a science fiction reader of aliens that really captured your imagination?
Boy, I love Werner Vinge, his books. I love his depiction of aliens, and one thing it taught me was that if you're telling a story from an alien point of view, at its heart, you have to have some sort of human characteristic that you can latch onto. Otherwise, you don't relate to what's going on. You can have weird aliens that are, that nobody understands and that are bizarre, but you can't tell a story from that point of view. It's got to be, if you're doing a story like that with aliens that you can't understand, then the point of view has to be from the human point of view. But once you get into that alien mindset, there's got to be something that the reader can latch onto. Maybe it's feelings of, being maternal feelings or hunger, or something that, as a reader, you can latch onto.
Are you thinking he has the telepathic dogs that sort of, they get more intelligent the more of them are together? Is that what you're thinking of?
That's one of them. Yes, absolutely brilliant. And
yeah.
That is it. And also, I think in that same book he has sentient spiders as well that are phenomenal.
Yeah, no, that's such a cool idea. Some of my favorite aliens, Larry Niven came up with a lot of my favorite aliens. So like the puppeteers in the Known Space stories and the Modis in The Bone God's Eye. Those kind of stick out to me as some of my favorite aliens in science fiction.
Those are favorites of mine as well. I love Larry Niven.
Yeah. So tell us about some of your aliens. You have these aliens that they hibernate half of their body at a time.
Yeah, the Quackaroons. They're avian aliens. And the idea came from a trip I took to the Galapagos Islands, where I was being shown albatrosses nests. And one of the things the guide told us is that albatrosses fly over the oceans for long periods of time, sometimes days, weeks at a time without landing. And what they did during their travels is half their minds would go to sleep, and the other half would guide itself through the air. And it was a interesting biological mechanism. I think there's some fish that do that as well. But once I heard that, I immediately researched the topic, and the Quackaroons were then born. My avian bird creatures who, they have two different personality types. So that's where the idea came from for the Quackaroons. And so the idea in that story is that the Quackaroons produce this substance in their eggs that, when consumed by human beings, creates feelings of inspiration, and they invent things. So humans are on the hunt for these alien eggs. And the story is about, exploitation and colonization, and there's a little twist at the end, which I really enjoyed. But that's where the idea came from.
Yeah, well, and sort of the way I read it was it's almost like it's like the left brain, right brain thing, and so when they touch the ground, the two halves of their personalities are integrated. Which I thought was a really interesting idea.
Yeah, that's right. When it's flying, it's more of an immature creature, and then once it lands, it becomes a different personality type.
Yeah, so that's really cool. And then talk about these aliens. They communicate via scent, and they have no concept of hearing.
Sure. I don't think they have names in the story. I call them the centers when I talk about them. But this was in my story, the scent of their arrival. They're aliens that communicate simply by releasing a mist in the air, and ideas are exchanged through scent, and this rather than by sound. And they're on a very geologically active world where it's from an evolutionary perspective, it's easier to communicate through scent, through these mists, than through the use of sounds. And
because it's so noisy that you couldn't hear what anyone's saying.
Right, that's the concept.
Yeah,
it's lots of earthquakes, and it's always geologically active. So, they communicate by scent, and the story, and they're trying to decipher a human communication, but there's no scent track on the communication, so they're trying to make heads or tails out of this human hologram that's telling them a story. So, those are my centers.
And this story is really interesting because there's sort of two parallel stories going on, where there's the centers, and then there's what's going on the communication, the human communication that they're trying to decode, which has a little bit of a sort of a horror. I mean,
I definitely,
despite what we were saying about genre bending earlier, there's a little bit of genre bending going on in this story, it seems like.
I definitely went crazy in this one, because it's the apocalypse. There's interdimensional vampires. There's first contact with aliens. There's the scenting communication. I definitely put out all the stops for this one. And you're right, it is a combination of science fiction and horror, because half the story is told from the point of view of these aliens who are engaging in first contact with a spaceship that's orbiting their world. They're trying to figure out what the aliens want. And then the second story is the story being told by the human holograms. And the story that's being told is really a horror story about an interdimensional rift that opens up, and vampiric creatures that stream through and swarm the earth. And when I wrote the story, by the way, I submitted it to Interzone, and the assistant editor at the time, Jutsi DeVries, came back to me with some comments. He was worried that I was referring to the creatures as vampires. He thought that there were too many vampire stories that were being written, and he suggested I just not refer to them as vampires and keep it strange. But although anybody reading the story will realize these are these are vampires. So there's no word. The word vampire does not appear in the story, but they're definitely vampiric creatures that are swarming through that interdimensional rift and bringing the apocalypse to mankind.
Well, and they have all these sort of classic vampire characteristics, like they can turn into mist, and they require an invitation before they can come into your residence and stuff like that. But it's all sort of scientifically rationalized in a way, almost like I Am Legend or something.
Yeah, it's like the person telling us the story is trying to come up with scientific explanations for these apparently supernatural properties that these creatures have.
But it's really interesting to see. I mean, so the humans try to create giant sun lamps all over the place and have robots that stick the vampires with wooden stakes and things. It's kind of interesting to see this advanced technology versus versus vampires thing play out.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help it. I've often tried writing fantasy stories, and I wind up turning them into science fiction stories. And in this case, I think I started writing a horror story and turned it into a science fiction story. But I like that. I like giving it a scientific approach, and having the protagonist looking at it from a scientific perspective.
Yeah, I mean, and it works really well. I mean, just the ending of this, when it clicked where the story was going, I was just kind of like, oh man, it just made my skin crawl. It's creepy.
Oh, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, and so then the other alien, obviously, we have to talk about is the Worgen. So tell us about the Worgen.
Oh, yes, the Worgen.
Hmm.
It's taken up so many years of my life. The Worgens are aliens who are biochemically addicted to humans, in the sense that they're smitten with humanity. And they call it love. They need, once they make first contact with humanity, they realize they want to be around humans. They want to help humans. They want to just look at humans. And the catch is that humans find the Worgens viscerally repulsive. They're white, they're scaly, they stink of vinegar, and humanity wants nothing to do with them. But on the other hand, they're offering all of this superior technology. So of course, we take the technology and create these partnership agreements where Worgens get to hang out with us and stay 10 feet behind us, but they can watch us and be with us. And in exchange, we get to use their technology and colonize the solar system and the cosmos. And I've written a number of stories in this universe because I just think that I love the idea of the Worgens as a symbol for unrequited love. I mean, they love humanity so much, but humans want nothing to do with them. And I think it's a feeling that's universal to all of us. I think for all of us at some time in our lives, we maybe feel love and it's not reciprocated. So I think it's just rife for storytelling. And I've written 11 stories now in the Worgen universe. And all of them explore different types of love: maternal love, romantic love, courtship. Even one of my stories explores the love of a human and their pet dog. So I just think it's fodder for great stories. And even the relationship between humanity and the Worgens is it's like a big romantic relationship. You get to see the courtship. They get together, they get married, they have some tiffs, they divorce, and then maybe they reconcile, maybe they don't. I haven't figured out my ending yet. But the whole thing tracks the arc of a romantic relationship over hundreds of years. So the first story that I wrote is called Longing for Longolana, and it appears in the collection. But I've also, as I mentioned, I put together 11 stories into a novel, a mosaic novel called The Love War. And it's sitting with a publisher right now, so I'm hoping to hear back with some good news, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've read 3 of the stories, and I think that they're phenomenal. So, yeah, I hope that gets published, yeah.
Well, thank you.
Do you remember at this point what the first sort of seed of this idea was, or?
I think it's unrequited love. Feeling that particular feeling, because I always think that the most successful science fiction stories, despite all that we've talked about aliens and science fiction concepts, traditional science fiction concepts, I think that at the heart of successful of any story there's got to be some emotion. And so whenever I start a story, I always think about the emotion that I want to convey to the reader. And in this case, I wanted to explore unrequited love. That was the seed. And then I thought, well, what if the aliens are really interested and at first I thought, what if the humans were interested in the aliens? But I thought it was weirder because we always, any alien that we would encounter would be so far beyond us that I thought it would be much weirder if they're suddenly obsessed with us. So I took that route instead. But that was the seed of it, just unrequited love.
Well, I mean, there's a story in this collection called Naked Weekend, and it's about a couple who have sort of nano machines to regulate their emotions and keep their marriage stable and everything. And then they try going the weekend without it, and suddenly their whole relationship is called into question. And I was wondering if that was, and I think it was published before any of the Worgen stories. So I was wondering if that was maybe any of the ideas from that fed into the Worgen stories, because it's sort of that same idea of what is love really and how much is it biochemical and what does that mean and so on.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I'd never made that connection before, but you're right. It was written before the Worgens. It wasn't conscious, but I definitely in that particular story, the idea was I wanted to write about the fact that we live in such a highly medicated world these days. So many people are on antidepressants and other drugs that control their emotions, So I just wanted to take that idea to the extreme and create a society where literally every emotion is regulated. And, you're only allowed to feel a certain amount of anger or a certain amount of any particular emotion. And people have wristlets that allow them to kind of control their emotions, but within regulatory bounds, they're not allowed to do certain things, feel certain things. And as you mentioned, this couple goes quote unquote naked for a weekend and feel their real emotions. And I try to keep it a little bit ambiguous. Actually, I thought the easy ending to the story would have been to say, hey, this is all wrong and emotions are good. But I wanted to make it a little bit more ambiguous and point out to the fact that a lot of times some of the worst things that happen in the world are due to negative emotions. So I kept it a little bit ambiguous, but that was the idea. The fact that we're also medicated. What would happen if we were really, truly medicated to, completely?
Well,
So.
and I mean, that's one of the things that I want science fiction to do. This is what Greg Egan calls burning the motherhood statement, where you don't want every story to just be like, oh, this new technology sucks and no one should use it. And the story is just like, oh, yeah, it's bad. Now we're going to go back to being real and natural and everything. You want there to be a more nuanced, complex relationship between humans and advanced technology.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Like in that story, I was definitely going for the ambiguity because, like I said, you should walk away thinking, well, it's not good to regulate all these emotions. But then at the ending, there's a little twist where you see the real world and what, the results of naked emotions and where that takes us, so that you're left questioning yourself about maybe there should be some way to control our emotions at least to a certain extent. But that's what makes us human on the other hand. So it's definitely ambiguous.
Well, and I think there's an interesting conversation in the Longing for Longolano where the human tells this alien who's in love with him, you're not really in love with me, it's just this biochemical thing. And she says, well, human love, I've been reading up on it, it's just biochemical, it's just dopamine and things like that. I think I might have the quote, the heightened neural activity in the ventral tegmental area. And so it is an interesting question. What does it mean for love to be real? And if you take a drug that cancels out the biochemical feeling, is that the quote unquote real state, or is the state you were in to begin with the quote unquote real state, or does real really have any meaning in this context?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. After 11 stories in the universe, I don't know the answer. I still don't know the answer, right? But I think that it's a fun question to explore. What is real love? And is it the chemicals that prompt love, or as one of the characters says, is it love that prompts the chemical reaction? That's what I explore in the Worgen stories for sure.
When you just think about, I mean, like obviously a parent is much more likely to love their child than some other random child who may have, more attractive characteristics or whatever, so is that then, are they like helpless before that or something, but I don't know. It's a weird thing to.
No, it's absolutely fascinating, the concept, I think. And one of my Worgen stories is about maternal love, and it involves a Worgen who adopts two children. I'm sorry, a human woman that adopts two Worgen children and their relationship and the feelings of maternal love and what they mean, what that means. So definitely an area that I've enjoyed exploring.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned too, I mean, another moment from the stories I read that I really found memorable is you mentioned the dog, and the alien says, we give you all this to the humans, says we give you all this technology and we just praise you all the time and we just love you so much, and you despise us and you just love this dog and it doesn't do anything really, just sort of sits around, and that was really interesting too.
Yeah, absolutely. Hard to explain, right? But it guess it defies explanation.
So you mentioned this novel, the Mosaic novel has 11 stories in it?
Yes, it has 11 stories, including a huge novella that as well. It's called Free Fall. That's included in there as well. But yeah, it's a total of 11 stories. And I went back and I reworked them so that there is a smooth arc. You can read one story after the other and you can see that one follows the other, and that the relationship between humanity and the Worgens, it changes from the first story to the 11th story.
And how many of those have been published out of those 11?
6 have been published and 5 are new.
And are you planning to try to publish those 5, or are they just part of the bigger novel?
I haven't tried to publish them yet because I think that the novel will be more sellable if it's got more original content in it. So I'm not looking to publish them yet. So we'll see. Hopefully we can get the book published.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, I think that would be really cool.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I want to ask you about is I feel like a lot of these stories are pretty disturbing. I'm going to mention, well, how about I'll start off with Snatch Me Another.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take these in sort of ascending order of disturbingness. But talk about Snatch Me Another.
Snatch Me Another is one of those science fiction stories that has a central conceit of a technological innovation. It's a snatcher, it's called, a device that allows you to, it's like a barrel-shaped device that allows you to literally stick your arm in, reach into another dimension, and pull something back. Now, you put a little homing device in it, sort of like, let's say you take a pen, and you put the pen in the barrel, and then if you reach into the barrel, you can take up another version of that pen from another dimension. So, in that way, humans start snatching things that they need from other dimensions. And it starts off pretty, starts off with some pretty minor things, like paper plates and inhalers and loose change. And then slowly you realize, as you come to read the story, that as you've been reading it, you realize that the main characters in their story, their child is not their real child. Their child is dead, and they've snatched a duplicate from another dimension. Which is a very disturbing concept.
Right, and then there's another story called Dear Annabelle's, which is set in the same world, right?
Yeah, and the funny thing is I wrote Dear Annabelle's first, although I published it later, but Dear Annabelle's is a series of Dear Abby letters, and all the letters are about the Snatcher. Different problems that people have with people coming over from other dimensions and using their bank accounts or wearing their clothes. And it's really banal stuff. And the advice is always, take some intoxicants, go get drunk. Really the world's worst advice. But it just gets weirder and weirder as the story progresses. And you see the world kind of breaking down as these interdimensional walls come down. And the real trick of writing that story is that the real story is off screen. You're reading these letters about these banal problems. I'm trying to plan my wedding and my duplicate, my aunt's doppelganger won't come to the wedding, really banal stuff like that. But the real story is the story of the earth, the world, what's going on in the background of society. And it's between the letters, between the lines, that you realize that things are really falling apart. So, I really enjoyed writing that one. It was a real challenge.
How did you get the idea to write it in the advice column format? It's hard to say. I read a lot of Dear Abby letters when I was a kid, but I wanted to tell it in a non-traditional format, and somehow the idea came to me. So were you a fan of Dear Abby, or you just had nothing better to do? Or
I think it used to be a regular column in the tabloid newspapers in New York. So whenever you read back when there were solid hard copy newspapers that people routinely read, you open it up and there's Dear Abby. So you just kind of, read your horoscope, you read Dear Abby. So, yeah.
Because like you said, in the story, the person's giving terrible advice.
Yeah, I mean, it gets worse and worse as the letters go on.
So I guess I guess you wrote that story and then you thought, oh, I could make this 10 times worse, or like, here's a way I could make it 10 times worse.
Yeah, exactly. And once I'd finished it, I took one of the letters and I said, the letter involving the duplicate child that's taken from another universe. And I said, this is really a great idea. And then I turned it into Snatch Me Another.
Yeah. So that was pretty disturbing. And then we come to this story. It's called Tu Sufrimiento Shall Protect Us.
Yeah. That one is horror, and it's the most horrific story in the collection for sure. And it's also the most political story in the collection, because it's the seed for that story was a debate I was having with a friend of mine about Guantanamo Bay and the torture that was taking place at Guantanamo Bay at the time under the Bush administration. And a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, who was of the view that, well, it's unfortunate that this is happening, but, we have to do it. We have to do it to keep ourselves safe. There's no choice. And obviously I disagreed, but I thought, that's a really great idea for a story. What if it's true, there is no choice. We have to torture somebody in order to keep ourselves safe. So in the story, it's magic. The idea is you capture a terrorist, or you capture somebody who is of the same ethnicity as a terrorist. You put them in your basement, and using magic, you keep them alive, and you torture them endlessly. And as long as you do that, you believe you can keep everyone safe. So that one was disturbing to write for sure.
Did anyone respond? Like, did you get any responses to the torture stuff in the story?
What do you mean by responses? Like from readers?
Or from workshoppers or things like that.
Some folks in the writing group were very disturbed and didn't like the story because it was so graphic. Some of the reviews the story got were right on the nose. They got exactly what I was going for in terms of, even though, there's no politics overtly mentioned in the story, they realized right away that it was about our policy of torture at the time. So that was interesting that people actually, picked up on what I was going for.
And there's a lot of Spanish in the story.
Yeah, I'll confess, I had just read Junot Diaz right before I wrote this story, and he had used a lot of Spanglish in his novel. The name escapes me right now, but
The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde.
Thank you. Yes, that one. And I thought, I've never seen this done in any sort of speculative works, this type of language. So I thought I'd give it a shot. Certainly, I grew up in the Bronx. I'm Latino, so I've been around people that speak Spanglish. So I thought I'd incorporate it into the story.
So, do you think you'll do any more of that?
Maybe. I was really happy with that one. It was nominated for the World Fantasy Award. And so I was quite pleased, but I haven't thought about going back, but maybe.
Okay, and so then the third story I have here on my list of disturbing stories is called Sleeping with the Anemone.
Yes, that one is more satirical than the others. It's definitely a satire on space opera, and the idea is that there's I think there's a line in the story. There's one commonality, one trait that crosses the species divide between humans and aliens. That's pornography. So the idea is that it's somebody who's filming porn movies involving humans and aliens, and basically it goes viral, and there's a whole underground market. And the story is about somebody who's filming one of these movies. But it's definitely tongue in cheek for sure. It's not it's not horror. It's supposed to make you smile a little bit at how ridiculous it is.
Well, but these aliens, they're not like Spock. These are like really non-human aliens.
Yeah, they look like anemone. So they look like anemones. So, but one of the characters goes fishing for one. So that's what I mean by tongue in cheek. He literally puts a fishing rod in under some ice and fishes one up out of the ice.
Yeah, but it gets really dark too. I mean, it's not just a barrel of laughs.
Yeah, it has some dark elements to it for sure.
That was interesting though, because I guess that's true that porn cuts across interspecies or something. I mean, like, I guess it depends on whether they're sexual or have uplifted themselves out of biological bodies or anything like that. But yeah, you don't think about aliens having porn so much, but I guess when you think about it, yeah, I mean, they probably would.
It's not something one normally thinks about. This is true.
And so again, did you get what kind of responses did that story get?
Not, I didn't get any strong responses to it, surprisingly. I thought that the writers group, thought that it was, funny. A few people were bothered by it, but didn't get as strong a response as Tu Sufrimiento did. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, just to, like,
Probably because because all the stuff is being done to aliens, as opposed to and sufrimiento is being done to a human being.
huh? Yeah. I mean, could you talk about the process of publishing this book, of putting all the stories together and making a book out of it? How did that come about?
Sure. I had been solicited by Ian Waits out of England for an anthology he was putting together called Solaris Rising 2. He had published a successful anthology called Solaris Rising, and he asked me, he's familiar with my work from Interzone, so he asked me if I could contribute a story, and I had a story that was ready to go when he contacted me, so I sent it off to him. He liked it, took it, and then a few weeks later he said, "Hey, I've read your work in Interzone, I like this story. Would you be interested in putting together a collection for my press, my small press, Newcon Press?" So I said, "Absolutely." So, we sat down and put together the collection.
And so, how did you decide what order to put the stories in?
Well, I gave it a lot of thought. I mean, I think that I thought about leading off with Longing for Langalana because I think it's the most emotional story in the collection, but I thought it was also very long. I wanted to start off with a story that would grab you and that would be shorter. So I thought that Dance of the Cockaroons was the ideal story length, and it was, and it had like a little twist, had a twist ending that I thought would hook readers to see what the next story was about. So I decided to lead off with Dance of the Cockaroons. Then I went into Longing for Langalana. I figured once the reader is hooked, they'll read what I think is the strongest story. And then, from then on, I went with Missionaries because I thought it was, again, strong sci-fi, faith and religion as the central concepts. And, Snatch Me Another and Dear Annabelle's kind of, I was really proud of Snatch Me Another. And then, Dear Annabelle's kind of seemed to follow right after that one. And, yeah, it was, I gave it some thought. It was like sometimes when you listen to an album growing up as a kid, you always think, gee, I would have let off the album with this other song because it's more likely to hook listeners. I definitely thought about that when putting together the collection. I wanted to make sure that the first few stories hooked the reader.
Well, and then you end with Answers from the Event Horizon, which has a nice sort of optimistic kind of button on the whole collection.
Yeah, absolutely. The concept in that one is, what if you had a limited amount of time to a limited amount of time to ask questions to an intergalactic intelligence? What would you ask? And I also had a word limit because I was submitting it to Nature magazine, so there really was a limited window because I had a limited number of words. But I asked the questions that I would ask. Does God exist? What is the meaning of life? All the big questions. And of course, I had to formulate answers to those questions, which was not easy. Yeah, I think that story does present my point of view, and it is an optimistic point of view.
Well, I mean, speaking of Does God Exist? I mean, you mentioned too the story Missionaries, where it's a kind of future like Star Trek, where religion has just kind of, shriveled away. Do you think that that's kind of the future that we're headed for?
I think so. I wanted to explore the concept of faith in that story, but I didn't want to do like a religion bashing story. That was my worry. And the first few drafts of this, I thought kind of were leaning that way. And luckily the writers group pointed that out to me. So I decided to try a whole different tack. And I decided to make my protagonist, who you're relating to the most, to move her on a path towards faith and towards religion. And I thought that way it wouldn't look like I was religion bashing, because I really wasn't. I wanted to just explore how little difference there is between, when you talk about, physics and you talk about religion, there's a lot of similarities when you talk about the Big Bang and concepts like that. And I wanted to kind of explore that in the story without necessarily being pro or con as to religion itself.
Well, right. So in the story, humanity has passed through a period where there was pretty much no religion, it sounds like. And then these people called Quantists come about, which is a sort of new, sort of scientific-y religion. The person says, "We don't believe in a personal deity, but in a unifying theory of reality rooted in quantum phenomena beyond our ability to understand something we call the creative force."
Yeah, that's me making stuff up. Yeah, I think that's kind of a blend of what I was talking about. I could see things moving in that direction right now. When you get to these really profound ideas in physics that we don't really understand, it reaches a point where it becomes almost indistinguishable from religious concepts. So I thought that would be an interesting direction to head to in the future.
So when you're talking about, like you mentioned earlier, creatures made out of dark energy, are you just making that up because it sounds cool, or is there any, I don't know, have you read any books where people are seriously proposing ideas like that?
Well, I've certainly, like I said, seen a lot of science shows that talk about dark matter, and it's something we don't understand. So it's rife for speculation. So I thought, hey, let's create some dark matter beings and stick them in a story.
Well, because I guess that's an idea that is mentioned in one of the stories, is that the sort of matter that we're made out of is actually the minority of matter in the universe. So, aliens might think of us as being made out of exotic matter.
Right, exactly, yeah.
I was just curious about this. So in that same story, Missionaries, there's a Dr. Michael Byers, and then in Dear Annabelle's, there's a Dr. Gregory Byers, same spelling. And I was just curious if there's any connection there.
They're cousins. No, it's weird that you mentioned that. I didn't realize I put the name in both stories, but I did know a Michael Byers when I was growing up in high school. So I often will stick in familiar names into stories. I mean, the characters have nothing to do with the actual people, but I like to borrow names all the time.
I heard you say that longing for Longolano was sort of like Lana Lang from Superman was kind of inspired.
Yeah, it was kind of a silly idea that because when you're reading Superman stories as a teenager with Lana Lang and their kind of romantic interests, you know that he's going to wind up with Lois Lane. So I always felt bad for Lana, knowing that she ultimately would be spurned by Clark Kent. So I thought that I wanted to use her name in my Worgen story, since the story is about unrequited love. So I twisted her name around and came up with Langolana as the name of the planet.
Are there any sort of other names in there that people would recognize, like names of writers or science fiction references or anything?
Well, I mean, I have Lois is the name of one of the characters in Longing for Longolana. That's about it, though. I didn't want to it to be obvious. I didn't want it to be obvious to the readers.
Yeah. All right. So what are you working on now? Do you I saw you wrote a story with Matt Kressel recently.
Yes. It's actually the second collaboration I've written that's been published, or it's going to be published. First collaboration I did was with Eugene Myers, E.C. Myers, that was published in Space and Time magazine, and this one is that one is about, by the way, body hopping. It was a story that Eugene had written about a society where people kind of are able to move their personalities from one body to another. And it was a YA story, and all what I thought the sordid stuff was outside the story pages. And I told him, Eugene, the real story here is what's going on, what you didn't talk about. Like, what is going on with all this body switching? And so we sat down and we outlined a story about really twisted story about sex clubs, where people go to these sex clubs to try out new bodies and have sex in them. And that was another really twisted story. I was really happy with that one, and it was I really enjoyed that I made Eugene write such a sick story. But my latest collaboration, yes, is with Matt Kressel. It's a story that's going to be appearing in Analog called The Walk to Distant Suns, and it's basically a story about a space station that has a wormhole that allows us to travel to a new Earth that's being colonized, and basically the rich and the powerful get to go through, and people who don't have enough money, don't have the opportunity, can't have to wait in line and they can't get through to the New Earth. And it's told from the perspective of somebody who works in the station. She's been saving money her whole life to get her and her family through to New Earth. And at the last minute, prices are raised, so she can't afford to do it. And she needs to get her parents across because one of them is dying and they have better medical treatments on New Earth. So it's about, the lengths to which she will go to save her family and get them to New Earth. So I'm really happy with that one.
So do you guys like alternate scenes, or does one person write a draft and then the other person rewrites it, or how does that work?
The way it worked was we sat down in a coffee shop, came up with the central idea of the wormhole and somebody who's trying to get across. And then we mapped out the scenes one by one. It took us a few hours to go through and figure out what the action was that we wanted to take place in the story. So we had like 5 or 6 scenes described in a couple sentences. And then Matt went first, he wrote the first scene, sent it to me. I revised it and sent him back scene 2. He revised scenes 1 and 2, sent me back scene 3. And we just went back and forth, revising, sending back. And by the time we were finished, we both felt that we had written the whole thing ourselves. So that's a successful collaboration, I think.
Yeah, that's what I've heard about collaborations, is that you think it's going to be, you're going to have to do 50% as much work, and actually each person does 100% of the work.
No, that's absolutely true. Yeah. I mean, I've heard of other approaches where people will, sometimes somebody will write the whole story and give it to the other person to revise. Or, sometimes they literally will only write half the story, but this is what works best for me. And I did it in both stories that I collaborated on.
Mm-hmm. And I think I saw Matt say that this is the first time either of you have been in analog.
Yeah, this is really exciting. It's one of the markets I definitely was looking to crack. So exciting to be in it. Yeah, can't wait till it comes out.
It's the sort of bastion of hard science fiction, if people don't know that.
Exactly. Yeah, Asimov's, Analog, and FNSF are the core 3.
Yeah. All right, cool. So we're pretty much out of time. So do you have any other projects you wanted to mention, or any final thoughts or anything?
Not really. I mean, I'm always juggling a handful of stories. So, looking forward I tend to incubate my stories, like I'll write a first draft and then sit on it for a while, go back and revise it over and over again before it's ready to see the world. So I have about three or 4 stories that are just about ready to go out into the world. So, hope to get those out soon. So you'll be hopefully seeing them soon.
And hopefully we'll be seeing that novel, right? It's called The Love War?
The Love War, yeah. Like I said, it's been sitting with a publisher for a while, but just coincidentally, I received an email today saying that they were going to get back to me by the end of this month. So I should have an answer then, and we'll see.
All right, well, it sounds great, and I think we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Mercurio D. Rivera, and again, his book is called Across the Event Horizon. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, David. Really appreciate it.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Mercurio D. Rivera for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Ignacio, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.